So Amy Moore is the CEO of Let's Fix This and the Executive Director of the National Association of Nonpartisan Reformers. He is a passionate champion for democracy reform, cross-partisan bridge building, and civic participation. Melanie Wilson Rughani is an attorney and shareholder at Crowe Dunlevy, PC, where she serves as chair of both its Appellate and Initiative Petitions practice groups. She has substantial experience with initiative and referendum petitions, having represented both proponents and challengers at all stages of the complex Oklahoma initiative petition process. She is a firm believer in the power and necessity of direct democracy to move our state forward.
Super. Thank you. Come on through. You want to run the slides for us?
Sure.
Hey, thanks for having us. It's good to see you from the front. I sit back in the back. It's seeing you from behind. I know, and I'll preface this. This conference has been really great for me. I hope it has been for you because of the like diversity of topics, but the interrelatedness of it. So even things that you might not think are related on the surface, I think as we all get into each session, it's like, oh, classroom experience. While I'm not an educator myself, like deals with a lot of public education. I do a lot of presentations and speaking to audiences around the state about civic topics. And so I've learned like good tools to use. Even like yesterday, Cody and Mariana talked about some of the resources at the K-20 Center. And I was like, I'm going to make an adult civics course out of their resources and do it because we all could learn more about some of this stuff. So thank you for having us. This session is obviously more on the civic side of things. So maybe less related to classroom experience. So for educators, doesn't speak to that as directly. However, this 100% deals with democracy that we all live in. And in many cases, how it pertains to, I think, how our state runs. So.
Yeah. So thank you all for having me. As Andy said, I'm not an educator, and so I'm not a public speaker, so bear with me. We're here to talk about direct democracy, which we normally in Oklahoma think about as initiative petitions. I don't know if you've seen all the people out in their green shirts lately, sign my marijuana petition. When you go to the ballot and you're voting for candidates, and then usually the back page of your ballot has a paragraph on, do you think we should expand Medicaid? Do you think we should reduce the felony level from $1,000 to $500? Or, all the paragraphs at the back of your ballot that have a specific issue that you get to vote on individually rather than your legislator voting on it for you. That's direct democracy, where individual Oklahomans get to participate in actual policy making from the ground up. And it starts with people passing around petitions. Sign this petition. If we get enough signatures, we get it on the ballot, and then everybody gets to vote on it and make the final decision. Direct democracy, I think of as government of the people, by the people, and for the people, which is a Gettysburg Address, as you. Yeah. Direct democracy is not everywhere, so it varies state by state. Nation by nation. In Oklahoma, we have three forms of direct democracy: initiative petitions, referendum. So if the legislature passes a law and people don't like that law, they can referendum it, say, we don't want that law to actually become law. That's a referendum petition. And recall. So some public officials can be recalled by popular vote.
We've seen that here in Norman, or at least an attempt at it recently. And we'll talk more about the different types of initiative petitions in here. As I mentioned earlier this morning, the last couple of years, in 2019 and 2020, I was the director of an effort called People Not Politicians to pass an initiative petition for an independent redistricting commission. Melanie was our attorney for that campaign as well. And so it's given me a front seat at what this looks like on the ground or in the field. We'll talk a little bit more about that as well.
Yeah. So where is direct democracy? As I mentioned, we don't have a federal level direct democracy. It's all state-based. And if you notice, all those green states have direct democracy. What do you notice about them?
Mostly in the West.
mostly in the West. Why do you think that might be?
They joined the union later.
And what was going on about the time that Oklahoma? Civil War and shortly thereafter, yeah. And so what was happening in kind of politics? You had the height of the progressive movement, the popularism movement. You know, Oklahoma was a very popularist state when we created a constitution. And so Oklahoma was actually the second state to put the initiative petition in their constitution. It was at the height of the populist movement, and people did not trust the government. They did not trust rich people. They did not trust oil barons and steel barons and railroads and political machines. And so the people of Oklahoma, the big thing that differentiates the Oklahoma state constitution from a lot of other constitutions is there's a lot of power given to the people as opposed to our legislators. It was also during the progressive movement of women's suffrage, free silver, labor issues. And so that was seen as a way to get that stuff done without necessarily the people in power doing it for us.
I'm reading a book about the history of Oklahoma politics right now, and I just started the other day. But the first few chapters are about like not the anti-corporation movement, but just this like suspiciousness that Oklahomans had about corporate interests and corporate influence in Oklahoma. And it's so interesting to read it in light of like, well, if you go to the state capitol today and you read inside the dome, it's a bunch of business names, all the oil companies and Hobby Lobby that literally built the building. And you think, huh, how did that get there? What has changed over the last 150 years?
So we had a real distrust of what we have now, which is industry capture, where the oil industry, big businesses have a lot of influence in our government and literally built the building. Initiative petitions are the Oklahoma answer to that. They're also an answer to other kind of fundamental problems in our democratic politics and Democrat, small d. Gerrymandering. One problem that I think you all have talked about already is the people get gerrymandered into districts where they don't have an incentive to elect someone that's on the moderate or cooperative side. We get more and more extreme as districts get safer and safer for either party, and it becomes harder for the parties to work together across the aisle on issues. And so when you can put an issue directly to the people, should we expand Medicaid? Should we legalize marijuana? Those are things that aren't necessarily on one side of the politics or the other, but that people can work together in coalitions on it. Direct democracy helps us to bridge those divides. And same thing with gridlock. Sometimes you just have stuff, we see it a lot in the federal system, you just can't get anything done in government, and this helps us get things done outside the representative government process.
Can I give a specific example that I know we're going to talk about? But Medicaid expansion was debated pretty hotly for about 10 years in Oklahoma. The year that when we passed it in 2020, the legislature actually passed it. The governor vetoed it. So, we got a little bit further every time, and they got the bill all the way through, and the governor vetoed it. And then, all right, well, now we're just going to have to go to the ballot. It is often the last resort, and it is there for a reason, right? When politicians are unable or unwilling to pass laws that the people want.
You actually see initiative petitions moving our representatives sometimes too. So you saw it with the gross production tax a few years ago. There was a big movement. People wanted to raise revenue with the teacher walkout. We wanted to increase the gross production tax. And there was obviously a lot of pushback from that, from the legislature and oil companies and people with vested interests. So someone finally said, all right, we're going to put up an initiative petition to raise the gross production tax. And they wanted to raise it to 12% or something really high.
Oh, yeah.
And the legislature was like, oh, God, we can't do that. And so that having the availability of the initiative petition pushed some legislatures to compromise. And they raised the gross production tax to 5%?
Yeah.
From 2.5%. I probably have the numbers wrong, but it forced the legislature to do something that they otherwise probably would not have done had they not had kind of a threat of grassroots movements getting it much, much higher gross production tax. So direct democracy, initiative petitions, referendum are set out in our Oklahoma Constitution. You'll read in court cases, they quote the line that the initiative petition is the first power reserved by the people of Oklahoma. It was part of our original Constitution. It was a big part of our Constitution, and Oklahoma courts have traditionally protected the initiative petition mechanism pretty strongly in Oklahoma, Republicans and Democrats. Initiatives, we see a lot of them. A lot of them are filed. This chart was made, 2 years ago?
Mm-hmm.
So we're at initiative petition 434 now. So we've had 434 initiative petitions filed in Oklahoma since statehood.
And some of them are repetitive. Like for our anti-gerrymandering, we had 3 because we filed and had to make some changes and refile and make some changes. So it's not necessarily 434 separate issues, but at least 434 separate attempts to pass certain things.
I think we've had 15 marijuana initiative petitions in some form. But 434 have been proposed. We've had 88 actually voted on. So what happens going from 434 initiative petitions to only 88 have actually made the ballot? And of those 88, only 25, give or take a couple, in the last couple of years have passed. That's not a huge rate of success, but the things that it has succeeded on are pretty huge, like Medicaid expansion, medical marijuana, criminal justice reform. That's how we banned cockfighting. That's how you get to drink alcohol at a bar, liquor by the drink. It's unfortunately how we are gridlocked on revenue bills now in Oklahoma. You have to get a supermajority to pass revenue bills. It's how we got the Ethics Commission and the Judicial Nominating Commission in Oklahoma. It's how you get to go to Remington Park. Those are all things that arose out of the initiative petition process. And so they're kind of big issues that our legislature didn't want to touch. And so the people did it for them.
Yeah, the legislatively referred ones are ones that come from the legislature that if it's going to amend the state constitution, the legislature can't do it on their own. Thankfully, we have a check in this. And so they can refer things to the ballot and then it's up to us. And in some cases, those don't pass. They almost all get voted on, of course, but you can see that, only 58% of them, well, that's 58% of that number, only 189 of them actually pass. And this last column we'll talk more about towards the end of the presentation. This is the number that passed with more than 60% of voters at the ballot, or 60% of approval. And this is an important threshold because of some of the threats to direct democracy that we'll talk more about.
All right. I'm not going to go through this whole chart. It's super complicated. But I just wanted you to see in kind of a visual form how difficult the initiative petition process is in Oklahoma. It takes anywhere from, if you get extraordinarily lucky, 6 months to, if you get
an average of 300 days.
Yeah, it's about a year to get an initiative petition from pretty seriously drafting and filing to on the ballot. It's a long and arduous and expensive project where a lot can go wrong. We'll talk about each step pretty quickly. So if you want to do an initiative petition, I get calls on a daily basis from people who have an idea. I want to solve gun control. I want to increase penalties for domestic violence. Everyone has an idea, and some ideas are, have more people behind them than others. But almost every day someone calls and says, I heard about this initiative petition process. I want to do one. And so unfortunately, a lot of my job is saying, you need to get a lot of people behind you before you start talking to me, because it is long, hard, and expensive, and you want to have all those resources marshaled before you get lawyers involved. But you want to build a coalition. So Medicaid expansion kind of started with, I don't even know who started it here, progressive activists, but then they bring in the Hospital Association, and they bring in the Kirkpatrick Family Foundation, and they bring in all sorts of groups that have vested interests in this policy, and they get them together at a table and say, what should we do? Should we just expand Medicaid? Should we put it in the Constitution so the legislature can't tamper with it? Should we prevent work requirements on Medicaid? There were a lot of policy discussions that had to be had and hashed out before anything gets written down and filed.
Yeah, and this plays out differently. Sometimes it's an outside group. A few years ago, there was a state question about allowing optometrists to open stores in Walmarts, basically, right? And that was clearly presented by the optometrists. It wasn't like people were like, what we need is eyeglasses in Walmart, and we're going to rally around that. It was clearly, we'll say, a special interest, right? And then other things start more from the people, especially on the occasions we have like referendums trying to veto a bill. That almost always starts from citizens being upset about the legislature passing a law. For people not politicians, for anti-gerrymandering, I'd been having conversations about redistricting for several years with a lot of people, legal women voters, most notably. And after a bunch of conversations and this idea that like, well, we got to raise some money, and we managed to connect with some other groups that were willing to help underwrite some of that to help us get kickstarted. And so it really is, it can kind of start different places to get to the same endpoint.
Mm-hmm. Once you feel like you have a coalition formed, you're going to want to do kind of the nuts and bolts. This is when you pick up the phone and call me. You want to get a 501c4 put together so you can do campaign and ethics reporting and things like that. You want to, and so you can fundraise. That's the next point, is fundraising. And you'll see why. But in Oklahoma in particular, initiative petitions can be ridiculously expensive. And that's because of the laws that we have in Oklahoma that are designed to make the initiative petition process as difficult as humanly possible. So, when I started doing it, it was not that expensive. I mean, $500,000 was a reasonable target for an initiative petition. Now it's $1, $4, or $5 million to get an initiative petition all the way through the process.
So when it was originally placed in the Constitution, then did they add laws later to make it difficult?
Yes.
There's nothing that can stop that.
Very little. We could create a campaign to challenge those laws one by one, but they've been in place so long that I don't think it's going to be hugely successful. But it's kind of like, well, we've just chipped away at the accessibility of the initiative petition process for so long that now it's pretty inaccessible to people.
Wants to chip away at it some
even more, yeah.
we could run an initiative petition to make it easier, but by running it under the current laws, it proves that it's not insurmountable. And so it's one of those, it's a sticky wicket.
Someone did.
On the ballot when Governor Stitt had his on the ballot. That's where you want to go.
Yes. So there was actually an initiative petition, ironically enough, after the tornado shelters in schools initiative failed because they weren't able to get enough signatures in enough time. There was an initiative petition to eliminate the 90-day circulation deadline, which we'll talk about. And that failed because it wasn't able to get enough signatures in 90 days. So it's a hard process. But once you've got your nuts and bolts of forming the legal entity, getting some money behind you, you draft the petition. You want a lawyer to do that because it has to comply with some tricky laws that we won't talk about. And you need to get your organizing people in place before you file. You need people like Andy who know everyone in town and who can bring groups together who would support this and who would go out and collect signatures and be ready to start signature collection at the drop of a hat. Because, again, our crazy laws allow a protest period in the court and allow a Secretary of State to set a circulation date, and you don't know when that's going to be. You get 15 days notice. So within 15 days.
Sometimes in the middle of a pandemic,
yes.
Right before the 4th of July holiday.
Yeah. You've got to be able to either wait a year till litigation sorts itself out in court or be ready to go in 15 days. So you'd have to form the groundwork early.
And there's a reason that fundraise comes before draft petition, because you got to pay attorneys. If you've got friends in high places that are willing to volunteer their time, great. If it's not someone that has done this kind of work for a long time, I encourage you to also hire someone that has done this, because even well-intentioned attorneys may not be super familiar with the nuance of some of these laws. It's what I've learned. I have some other good friends beside Melanie that do this kind of work, and almost invariably you need more than one set of eyes. For example, with our campaign, we were fortunate to have some support from national groups like the Campaign Legal Center and the Brennan Center and those groups that were willing to review our policy. And I can't tell you how many conference calls sitting in my car I had, like trying to type cramped out in some rural area to revise a policy, and then for me to revise my slides to tell a crowd about the policy. So it's a lot of work.
Well, and my type of law, I just do this process. I don't know anything about Medicaid expansion. I don't know anything about redistricting. I learn it as this process goes on. But the subject matter experts, I represent the proponents of State Question 820 right now, marijuana legalization. I don't know anything about our marijuana laws, but I can just help you get it through the process of the initiative petition. So hiring circulators. Lawyers are expensive. We are almost free compared to these circulators. And so circulators, because Oklahoma, and I should have put this, I guess, before, Oklahoma has a 90-day deadline to get signatures. If you want to amend our Constitution, you need about 300,000 signatures from registered Oklahoma voters, and they have to be registered. So that's a lot of people that you've got to find that support your proposal and that are registered and can sign it properly in 90 days. That is, I think, almost impossible without paying people to go and circulate for you, or at least organize the volunteers who are circulating. Most initiative petitions have a paid arm and a volunteer arm. And so you've got people who you're paying to manage the volunteers, people to, get the petitions to you and collect the petitions and train people to make sure that they're telling people how to sign properly and looking up their voter address, things like that. You really need kind of an army of people to do all this in 90 days. You could do it if you had unlimited time. You could do it in a volunteer effort. I really don't think it can be done in 90 days with Oklahoma's laws on a purely volunteer effort. You've got to have at least a few people who their job is to make sure this happens.
Yeah, in a good campaign, you'll get 10 to 20% of the signatures you need by volunteer collection. Everyone, as a campaign manager and the person having to do the fundraising, you have an incentive to get as many volunteers as you can, because every volunteer signature is one you don't have to pay for. And the cost ranges, if there's two different ways to do it. Some people pay by the signature. So collectors are incentivized to get as many signatures as they can, right? So you get $4 to $7 per signature has been fairly standard. And usually kind of go up, right? So the first 100 is $4, and then the next 100 is $5, so that people are incentivized to do more. The other side, and this is what a lot of groups are moving towards, is just paying people an hourly wage, but with a quota, like we'll pay you $15 an hour, but you have to get this many signatures. If you miss your quota twice, we're going to let you go. And so there are local groups in Oklahoma that do this. Some of my friends that have networks of people that they can hire, and there are national groups that do this and have a lot of the infrastructure and technology that makes it a lot easier and a higher likelihood of success.
Yeah.
I'm curious about online petitions. Like, how is that? Is it different than standing out there?
So in Oklahoma, if you are asked to sign an online petition, it will have no legal effect. Just know that, those online petitions can be great organizing tools. They can be great to say, take to your legislature and say, we had, 100 people sign this petition, but it will have no legal effect. The only thing that has a legal effect is if someone's standing outside with a clipboard asking you to sign a sheet that looks like this. You all are welcome to sign this, by the way. But there will be someone, who is either paid or volunteered and trained to show you, you have to put the date and the signature and your name in these little boxes and your address. And it's a difficult process, intentionally so.
Yeah.
Is that the recreational marijuana?
This is, yeah.
Yeah, essentially the law doesn't allow for electronic signature collection for this kind of thing. anyone else who's doing like sign our petition is just a way to get email addresses and build the coalition, which is good, but it doesn't get you anywhere. We tried that. And so in 2020, when COVID hit and we couldn't collect signatures, along with any other state, a lot of the other campaigns for independent redistricting, in some states, they had the ability to use like, to do like a FaceTime where they had to see the person and watch them sign it and like get it notarized and mail it in. Some states could use DocuSign. Like there was a bunch of, and you know, talking to consultants who worked in other states, and here they're like, what about there? And we read the law as generously as you could in every which way, and it's just no option. The way the law is written says like you have to physically witness someone physically sign it in your presence and then get that piece of paper notarized.
Yeah, so the back of this sheet. So if you all sign these boxes, I then have to watch you sign them and sign an affidavit myself saying I watched you sign it, and then I have to go take it and get notarized. So it's a intentionally annoying process. And
just for reference, printing costs, right? Unless you happen to own a print shop, but generally printing all of these things is going to run a campaign about $30,000 just for printing alone. So like,
you notice this is, again, intentionally on non-standard size paper.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
So,
and they just changed the form 2 years ago. So these are the first ones with this form. I think the form is better than the old forms in most ways, but it's still a change and it is still tedious.
So if you could change the 90 days, what would it be?
well, so we'll talk in a couple slides about what other states have done that works a little better. But in Oklahoma, so you've got your petition drafted, you take it and you file it with the Secretary of State. That triggers a protest period. You've probably read about litigation challenging various initiative petitions. They almost always get challenged because there's a protest period that says, please challenge me. And so there's 10 days when anyone in Oklahoma can file a protest, and that triggers a Supreme Court proceeding that can take anywhere from a couple months to a year, depending on how motivated the Supreme Court is to decide that issue. You can challenge the constitutionality of the petition. You can challenge the form of the petition. You can challenge the gist, which is this little paragraph at the top of the page. You can say this isn't sufficiently explanatory. It's not good enough. I got to tell you, trying to put a 20-page initiative petition and describe it in a paragraph that will satisfy every member of that court is a tough job. And so it always gets challenged. Once you pass that litigation procedure and the court says, okay, this initiative petition's fine, go forward, that triggers your 90-day circulation period. The Secretary of State is the one that sets that period, and they have to set it between 15 and 30 days after the Supreme Court has said, go forward, this is fine. So you don't know when the Supreme Court is going to say, go forward, this is fine. So you've got to be ready to go again. You have 90 days to get the required signatures. If you look down at the signature requirements, a referendum. So you saw with the permitless carry bill, a group tried to put a referendum in place to repeal that bill. They needed 5% of the number of people who voted in the last gubernatorial election, which turned out to be about 60,000 signatures. They were not able to get it done because it was an all volunteer effort and they started kind of late. An initiative petition that's just statutory, so just puts in a new statute in our law that can then be repealed the very next day by the legislature, needs almost 100,000 signatures, or 8% of the people who voted in the last gubernatorial election. A constitutional change, you'll notice that most of the initiative petitions lately, Medicaid expansion, redistricting, those were constitutional amendments. And it's not because we necessarily think Medicaid expansion ought to be in the Constitution. That seems really silly to me, actually. But we have to put it in the Constitution because the reason you need an initiative petition is because your legislature doesn't want to do it, right? We couldn't get the legislature to expand Medicaid, and so the people had to do it. But if the people did it in a statutory way that only needs half the number of signatures, the legislature could turn around the next day and repeal Medicaid expansion. So it had to be in the Constitution to make it worth all this time, money, and energy.
Several years ago, we had state questions 780 and 781 that were criminal justice reform measures. They both passed the ballot in November, and then in February, a lawmaker filed laws to repeal them and got a decent way through the process. I mean, not without a lot of pushback, but he was like, I don't think we need to do it, and just kept running with it. And it was such a helpless feeling to be like, we just did all of this, man. Like, clearly the people want this. And so we know that'll happen. One of the ways that this may be a slide, but some other states have protections that say a statutory change can't be like passed by the people, can't be fiddled with by the legislature for 5 years. There's like a buffer period to let them get angry and then get over it, right? And then, because you don't want them to fire back when they're still in the heat of the fight. Yeah. So
We need that.
we do need that.
Yes.
So was it an initiative by the people of those states to do a buffer period? And if like we had to do that here, and then they just do the same thing with the buffer period?
We would have to amend the Constitution.
Yeah. And also, as someone said the other day, I think, Oklahoma's Constitution, at the time it passed, was the longest governing document in the world. It's still one of the longest governing documents. The point at which kerosene catches fire is enumerated in there because we didn't trust the corporations that were selling bad kerosene back in 1906. So there's a reason we have to amend the Constitution, is that there's just a lot of stuff in the Constitution that shouldn't be in there. But also now there's like a protective effort to it. So
But like governance is actively chipping away at Medicaid expansion, and there's not much we can do about
Right.
it.
Right.
yeah, I mean, they are beholden to what was passed by the state question. So they can't affect that,
Right.
but there's often so they try to control what they can control.
Finances. He's trying to.
Yeah.
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 Right. Once you've gotten finished with your 90 days of circulation, if you've got that large number of signatures, and you need a good buffer because some of those signatures are not going to be valid. They're going to be people's whose voting registration doesn't match the address that they put down. They're going to be some people sign Mickey Mouse, and there's going to be those people, but there's going to be we have about a 60 to 65% validity rate in a lot of initiative petitions. And it's not from people signing Mickey Mouse, it's from people getting their address wrong or thinking they were registered and they weren't, or things like that. Once you get through that, you turn all the signatures into the Secretary of State, and it's massive boxes of signatures. The Secretary of State, now, this is the first time they've had this kind of electronic form. They'll scan this through some software, and it'll spit out were these signatures valid or not, and they'll count them. It takes a couple weeks, assuming you get through that process. The ballot title that you submit, so which is usually similar to this gist, but not necessarily. The thing that actually appears on your ballot in the paragraph when you go vote, the Attorney General can look at that and say, we're going to write it this way instead. And there's a process for challenging that. There's also a second protest period in the courts. So if someone wants to challenge how we gathered our signatures, was there fraud involved? Were there enough valid signatures? Should some of these be disqualified? Things like that. That can go through the courts as well. There's a second protest period. Assuming you get through that,
Each of these carry a cost, right?
Right.
Like you got to pay attorneys for each of these steps. If there's a challenge to your signatures, then both sides, the challenger and the challengee, right, the campaign, have to pay for monitors to be there to watch them, count them, and go through it, which is extremely expensive.
Right.
$200,000 expensive just to have attorneys sit around and watch the process. Now it's costly for the other guys too, but
which is why you don't see a ton of signature challenges. The biggest challenge is at the beginning. But yes, it's a long and expensive process, and you don't have control. The biggest thing is you don't have control over the timing of a lot of this, which makes it difficult to plan and raise money. After all that process, Supreme Court litigation is finally resolved. The governor gets to set the date of the election. It automatically goes on the next general election, unless the governor issues a proclamation setting it for a special election. So you saw that happen in the Medicaid expansion. It would have automatically gone on the November ballot. He didn't want that, so he put it on the June primary, where he thought there wouldn't be much turnout. It's all, there's ways that various actors can do things to benefit whatever they want politically that you don't have control over. But we ultimately got to vote on it. And then everybody's vote counted the same amount, and it passed, squeaked by, just squeaked by, and became law. Between the proclamation setting the date of the election and the actual vote, you've got to run a campaign. And
I mean, you're probably already doing that, hopefully, but this is the final push because most voters don't really pay attention to that stuff until the last couple of months before the election, right? And, you know, with good luck, you've got a couple of months to do big ad buys, to do that last blitz of events, to get the word out to everyone else that you've missed so far. So that's when, you know, like candidate campaigns, that's when postcards and mailers and all that stuff starts going out, TV ads, all of that, all of which is extremely expensive as well, right? TV commercials, not cheap, especially if you're doing something statewide, right? Like a state house representative has just got to target their little area. Any kind of statewide vote requires a whole state. There's 5 media markets that affect Oklahoma. There's a lot that goes into it.
Then you vote, simple majority right now to approve. People ask what I do a lot, and I say this is my job. It's quite a process to get through the initiative petition process, but it can be done. It has been done for some big things. So this chart, not very elegant and a little bit out of date now. I made it 2 years ago, but lists kind of the big key points for these laws in various other states. We talked about only about half the states, a little more, have the initiative petition process, and then each state has their own laws that govern the initiative petition process. The number of signatures, usually based on the number of people who voted in the last gubernatorial election. You'll notice when you look down, Oklahoma, to amend our Constitution, has the highest signature percentage by far, except for Arizona. And what do you notice about the difference between Oklahoma and Arizona's laws if you go across this chart?
24 months.
Yeah, so Arizona has 2 years to collect what we have to do in 90 days, and it's still hard. Most states have a lower signature threshold and more time. So Oklahoma has done a pretty good job of making this process harder. The other thing that some states do is geographic distribution requirements. And so there were a lot of bills in the legislature this year that would have said, well, you know, it kind of followed after Medicaid. People said that was the urban voters outweighing the rural voters. And so we need to make sure rural voters are involved. Of course, rural voters get to vote the same number of times urban voters do, but they wanted to say we are going to have 15% of the votes cast for governor in every county of Oklahoma. So you've got to go out to Guyman and collect, 15% of the people who voted in Guyman. That is unbelievably expensive, right? Just because you've got to have people who are able to organize in every corner of the state, and it's just not very feasible.
And at that point, it's a minority control issue, right? The bottom 10 counties, I think the total population or cumulative population is like 75,000 people for 10 counties. Well, it doesn't weigh the same. And if you look at, this is a personal pet peeve, but after every election, the media puts out all the maps of who won what counties. And it's like, well, that doesn't really matter, right? Because you can win Oklahoma County and you can win Texas County. And just by the nature of winning 2 counties, it's not equal. Like Texas County has like 7,400 people, and well, that's more. It's Guyman, so it's like 20,000 people, and Oklahoma County has like 700,000 people. What's a 10-fold increase, 100-fold increase in that? Well, that's a big difference there. And so, also, all of these laws apply to us statewide. So having a majority vote just seems that's what most people expect, right?
So I think these geographic requirements are primarily to just, again, make the process harder, more expensive. Referendums, similar process. We don't see them very often because they require quick organizing, and they're not as effective necessarily as an initiative petition because you can't put them in the Constitution. But we saw one with permitless carry that failed. We saw one, the Coburn Referendum after the teacher pay raise back, was that a decade ago now? when we passed a revenue bill to fund a teacher pay raise, Senator Coburn and a group of people put forth a referendum to try to repeal that pay raise. We were able to get that struck down, so you never ended up voting on it. But there's just a handful of referendums that have happened, but that is available. The big key to know with referendums, it can't be used on any bill with an emergency clause. I get a lot of these calls too and have to say, sorry, I can't help you. If the legislature puts an emergency clause on the bill, which now they do almost as a matter of course because there's a supermajority in the legislature, you cannot put a referendum on that bill. That's just a rule in our Constitution if the legislature has determined that it's an emergency. So a lot of the bills that people would like to referendum are not available for referendums because they've already taken effect.
So there's no bar to clarify that this is an emergency and this really isn't.
No.
Doesn't mean anything.
And there's funny debate sometimes because they'll, they vote on the bill and they vote on an emergency clause, and some people will debate or challenge that and be like, why is this really an emergency? And they're like, well, we just need to get it in place quickly. And so most laws, when they pass, they're signed in, April, May, something, and then they go into effect, usually like November 1st is pretty common, right? So you've got some time to repeal them or to prevent them from going into effect, which is what a referendum does, unless there's an emergency clause and they get passed. So there's almost always an emergency clause on anything that is contentious because they want to just get it inked in stone. I guess you can't ink in stone, but you know what? Chiseled in stone right away.
The recall process, there's no statewide recall process. It's based on, usually in the city charter, will provide for a recall process. And I won't talk about that because there's a million different ways to do it. Just know that that's another option available that's part of direct democracy.
Yeah, so you can't recall the governor, but you can recall the mayor. Can we do this real quick?
Sure, yeah.
All right, and we've got about 5 to 10 minutes left. So some of the threats, and this, as you probably have surmised based on how we stack up against other states, and you can see some of the pros and cons of our system, mostly cons. I say mostly cons, except for the huge pro is that we have direct democracy, and not every state does. I have colleagues in other states that really have their hands tied. They're trying to work through maybe some cities have it, but maybe not statewide. And so we are very fortunate in that way, even though it is extraordinarily difficult. So some of the things that we've seen recently, including this legislative session this year and last year, have been bills filed that would make the initiative petition process much more difficult, if not impossible. Now, these are all things that they could theoretically, not all of them, I think at this point, most of the bad ones would have to be referred to the ballot for us to vote on. And historically, Oklahomans have not taken kindly to politicians trying to take away our power of direct democracy. And that's the case in other states as well. So we've seen, bills to increase the number of signatures, like change it from a percentage of turnout in the last gubernatorial election to a percentage of registered voters, which obviously not everyone, only half of people who register actually turn out. So that would double the number. Some cases, bills to make it a percentage of eligible voters, which is hard to calculate, and that would triple the number of signatures you need. And without an extension of time, it would make it impossible to do it. Changing geographic requirements like some states have, so a percentage of certain counties or certain congressional districts. Requiring a supermajority. So that table that I had, the 60% passage threshold, there were bills this year to raise it to 55%, one to raise it to 60%, one to raise it to 67%, right? To say that, anything that, and they tried to couch it in language that I think makes sense, like, constitutional amendments should be required to pass a 60% threshold. Well, there's only been 4 in state history that's ever got that high. And I agree that it should be hard to change the Constitution. And it is. It is really hard, as you have seen, to change the Constitution. That's why it's only happened 88 times out of 434 attempts. So restricting paid circulators. They tried to block hiring outside groups. We don't want these, liberals from Chicago coming in and collecting signatures or whatever they make up. And then and just additional fees. They in the last couple of years, they added a $1,000 filing fee. They've changed the form. They've tried to fiddle with things to make it a little more complicated. And then other stuff that we've seen, right? Like they slow play stuff. So you can file and then it's out of your hands. It's up to the court to do stuff. And there's no one that really controls the timeline for the court. The Secretary of State can hem and haw around or call you on July 3rd in the pandemic and tell you can start collecting in 10 days because they actually approved it 4 days earlier, but no one told you, like just little things like that. And then once it gets to the court, our court has been pretty strict on a single subject, and sometimes in ways that don't always make sense. They're pretty strict on the gist. Melanie had to write our gist, I don't know, 3 or 4 times to make sure that it met their criteria. And in fact, when you read the opinion, if you go back and read the opinions about the initiative for redistricting, some of the comments or opinions of justices conflicted with each other. And so there was like not a way to write the gist that made everybody happy. And I was like, well, dang it. So we had to kind of figure out, how do we get a majority of these people to think that our gist will be okay? And in some cases, even when the court is friendly or we think that maybe politically they're on board with the issue, they might rule against you just as a matter of course to be like, listen, we can't just rubber stamp you and let you go on through. We got to make you redo this as just like a political gesture, which is annoying. Did I miss anything?
No.
Okay.
So ways to make this process better. There are plenty. The biggest thing for me would be to extend the circulation period, like all those other states that allow either an unlimited circulation period, take as long as you like, or a couple years, even 1 year would be great. But when you've got to get that many signatures in that short a time, it forces you to get money involved. And that takes out the purpose of direct democracy in the first place, was it's supposed to be a citizen-led grassroots initiative, a process where ordinary people can have an idea and turn that into law if enough other people support it. That's just not the way it is in Oklahoma. You have to have money in order to get these things passed. And so we could restore kind of the purpose of direct democracy by a simple thing like eliminating the circulation period or making it longer.
Because Arizona also requires the 15%, but they have 24 months. So they have 8 times as long as we do. Which, if I had 24 months, like there's a good shot we could get those signatures without paying somebody to collect them, right? It's a lot of work, but it's possible. And right now it's not.
Yeah. The other thing I think that would make a huge difference, that is one of those issues I think everybody could get behind, is protecting statutory initiative petitions from the legislature. So we talked about why Medicaid expansion is in our Constitution. It's not something you would expect to see in the Constitution. It should have been done statutorily, but it couldn't be because there's nothing to prevent the legislature from the very next day saying, yeah, we're not expanding Medicaid. So if we had some provisions, either a waiting period or a supermajority requirement, the legislature would have to, get 3/4 of the legislature before they could overturn something passed by the people. Other states have done things like that. You can prevent a lot of this stuff from having to be in the Constitution and becoming much harder to change 10, 15, 20 years down the line if it doesn't make sense anymore. And you can make the process easier because you need fewer signatures. Also, the court has actually kind of done this accidentally, I think, with this last round of initiative petitions, but it would be nice if there was, instead of having to go through the entire litigation process and then start over again if the court doesn't like the one paragraph you wrote at the top of the page to describe an enormous policy change. If you could submit it to someone, the attorney general or the court or someone, and say, here's our proposal, write a gist that you think is fair that we can then circulate. That would eliminate a very expensive part of the process and reduce kind of litigation gamesmanship. People like to make the process take longer so that you'll maybe miss the next general election ballot by filing a challenge to the gist. Even if the gist is fine, they know that everybody can debate whether this gist is sufficiently explanatory or not. And it's a good way to slow a process down. And you could eliminate that with some sort of pre-clearance mechanism.
That's actually one of the threats I forgot to mention, is that they've proposed requirements for the gist that would almost always require the campaign or the petitioner to include a fiscal impact statement, right? So basically saying this will cost $2 million or whatever, because voters don't like voting for things that they think are going to cost money, right? And so that's obviously an attack on how to do that. Now, it's all the proposals have been really subjective. Like they don't say who would make the fiscal impact statement or any, and a lot of people could say, like for independent redistricting commission, it might cost the state money to pay a commission, but we don't know how much is being paid on redistricting right now. So it could actually save the state money. There's no way to do it. And the proposed kind of things to add that fiscal impact statement have always been only if there's a cost. They don't require you to say if there's a savings, right? Wouldn't that be nice if we could say this will save the state $1 billion over 10 years? They don't want that in there because that might be too enticing to voters. I think that's it on our slides. We've got just, 2 minutes left. So if there's any other questions, happy to answer them. Yes, sir.
When do they start chipping away on direct democracy, on the petition process? When did that start?
Good question.
That is a good question.
So Title 34 is the legislative laws that set in all these. I want to say that was passed in 1934-ish, but I could be very wrong about that. And it's gotten harder as time has gone on.
It almost always follows the successful passage of something that politicians at the time don't like. And Melanie referenced this, in 1990, they passed they passed a big tax increase. The legislature did. The people didn't like it. And so the people passed State Question 640, which requires the legislature henceforth for any revenue raising measures, any tax increases, that it requires 3/4 majority of both chambers to pass it, which means it's almost impossible for our state legislature to raise taxes, which is why they didn't from 1992 until, 1990. No, I guess it was 92. The tax increase was 90. The state question was in 92. And they didn't raise revenue at all until 2017. So from 92 to 2017, there was no tax increases on the state level because of that. They kept cutting it instead. And we got in a real pickle there. We were like $1 billion short for a couple of years. And that resulted in huge cuts to every state agency. And in response to that tax increase, Coburn and Crowe tried to repeal it. And so you start seeing this tit for tat response. And that ends up chipping it away, even about a specific issue. They, rather than, what's the phrase? Cut off your nose to spite your face, right? Those kind of things is what happens. Any other questions? All right, super. Thank you very much.